name is Julia Haggerty. I'm an associate professor of geography at Montana State University, and I want to welcome you to this book talk with the author, Dr. Martin J. Pascaletti. And the book we're discussing today is The Threat of Energy, which will soon be released to the public by Oxford University Press. And you'll be able to find that book as a Vital Source e-text, as well as a hardback available through major retailers. So what I'd like to do is first introduce our guest today, and then give you a little overview of what we'll talk about, and we'll get right into a discussion. So known to his colleagues as Mike, Dr. Pascaletti has a very distinguished career. He is a professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University, where he co-directs the Energy Policy Information Council. He has a very distinguished and illustrious career marked with a number of awards, which include being elected as a fellow to the American Association of Geographers and receiving numerous awards, including the Alexander and Ilse Melamed Award from the AGS. Mike was educated in the UC system, where he received a BA from Berkeley and left briefly to go to Louisiana State to receive his master's, and then completed a PhD at UC Riverside. I'll tell you a little bit about the book, just so you know what we're talking about. This is a 14-chapter book that's about 500 pages. It is filled with figures and beautiful photographs. Those who receive the hardback version will get the full color insert that's in the text, and those 14 chapters in the organization reflect the linkages of the book to Pascaletti's longstanding course at Arizona State called The Threat of Energy. And the book really focuses on the way that energy is intertwined with all aspects of human geography and the human experience. So this will be an idea that's familiar to energy geographers, the idea that energy is a social phenomenon with some technological elements and not the other way around. It's really kind of the core organizing feature of the book. And this is a book that I think is going to receive a tremendous amount of attention as well as use. And one indicator of that is the fact that one of the real leading lights and inspiring figures in the field of energy and society, Vaclav Smil, professor in Canada, wrote about the book, quote, "In our post-factual world of instant, simplistic expertise based on shallow learning, it is important to have books such as Pascaletti's wide-ranging survey, which is factual, historically grounded, and mindful of complexities." So I want to thank Mike for being here with us today, and thank the AGS for creating this creative and wonderful forum for us to learn from the author about the book. So I'll start with a question just about the book's origin and its approach. We'll soon dig into the topics of the ways that energy intersects with inequality and issues of injustice. But first, to set the stage, let's learn about why this book, why now? So Mike, tell us about how long this project has been in the making, who it's for, and how, as an author, you approached the project.
Well, thanks very much, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here in virtual form. The book actually derived from my 40 years of being at Arizona State University. When I got here in 1977, this was, as I sometimes say, tongue-in-cheek, a campus of tents and camels. It is in fact improved and has gone up into stratospheric levels in all sorts of ways, and I'm very pleased to have been here during that transition. And while I was here, and I'm still teaching, from about 1978 until the present, I've been conducting a field trip for my energy students. And I've been teaching a class called Energy in the Global Arena for decades as well. But it occurred to me that one thing was missing, and what was missing was the general understanding of how fundamental energy is. So everything flows from energy, and we've lost track of that fact, I think. And I wanted to see if I could do something to remedy it.
That's such a fundamental and interesting point. And I guess as a reviewer, I would just note for our audience that one of the challenges we have in reintroducing this kind of fundamental energy literacy has been a lack of really adequate textbooks. And so I think this book is going to be a really exciting addition in that space. But I do want to mention that the accessibility of the book and its ability to communicate this fundamental role that energy plays in all aspects of our lives need not be limited to the classroom. Gary Dirks, the former BP regional president, recommended this book to all readers with an interest in energy. So Mike, I want to kind of pivot a little bit to just thinking about, we're going to talk about energy equity and energy justice in a minute, but taking just the book as a project for a moment and thinking about the question of accessibility as kind of a key feature of how we think about equity and equity challenge and sort of energy literacy. So tell me about how you approached accessibility in this text.
This is a challenge, and this is one of the reasons that the gestation of this book was so long, 5 years or more. Although I've been teaching the class for 8 or 9 years, the issue was how do you get across to students at various levels? This is really intended for my introductory class on energy. That is the thread of energy. And I wanted to make sure that that the students were not completely turned off. So I made it accessible. I worked hard at the writing so that it was easy to read. And I included a lot of photographs and tables and so forth that the students can use, because knowing that all students don't operate in the same way, or don't learn in the same way. One of the most boring things is for them just to read page after page after page of technical jargon. And that's the way most of the energy books that I've ever seen, and I've looked heavily all over the world for a proper book, that's the way most of them are written. They're not all that accessible. They're often way too technical. And they don't have the kind of graphic underpinnings and supplements that I think are necessary to reach the kids. So it is meant for a general audience. It's not necessarily just college students. It could be advanced high school students. It could be undergraduate students. It could be the general public. I would in fact hope that people outside of academia would be interested in this book as well, because it's the only book I know of, and somebody can perhaps tell me that there's another, but the only energy book that I know of that's really circulates around a key concept, and that is that energy is tied to everything we do. Most other books just, as good as they are, and many of them are quite interesting books, they just go chapter by chapter, by resource to another resource, or by technology to another technology. I was trying to kind of go beyond that and make it accessible, make the writing flow, make the visuals attractive, so people would actually feel engaged and feel that they were being thought of when somebody was writing the book. So that is this idea that energy is a thread that travels through everything. That's the concept that holds the whole book together. And Julia, as you mentioned before, I look at energy as a social issue with a technical component rather than the other way around. I mean, to make an absurd analogy, if you didn't have people, you have to worry about energy access. So it's key that you understand that the societal aspects of energy are paramount, and we'll get into some of those issues associated with inequality and equality here in a few minutes.
Yeah, and just to close out this thread on kind of the composition of the book and accessibility, I'm really struck by the wide range of specific examples that are provided to illustrate the many points. And those seem to be curated, obviously, from this incredibly rich career that you've had. And they are a nice complement, in my mind, to other textbooks that are available to us that tend to have a very strong emphasis on a particular world region. I think our colleagues in the UK, in terms of the English language textbook space, have been a little bit out ahead of us in writing textbooks for energy and society courses. So I'm happy to have some examples for my students in the American West, but there's examples from all over the world. So how did you approach curating the case studies that illustrate the book?
Well, certainly that was intentional. And I try to include other countries and other examples because, in fact, many times those were the best examples. So we talked about India, we talked about China, we talked about Africa, we talked about South America, as well as North America. All the countries have a fundamental need for energy, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, energy resources are not evenly divided. I mean, this is the geography of energy in many ways, and because they're not equally divided, trade is essential, and not only trade, but everything that goes with it: money exchanges, geopolitics, military interventions. So once you understand kind of the geographical inequalities of energy resource availability, reserve availability, start to understand how fundamental this is. And we'll get into that a little bit. But if you just think about it, the South China Sea, for example, is just a powder keg ready to go, and a lot of it has to do with not just Taiwan, but it has to do with resources in the South China Sea and access that China needs. And there's many other examples. Sudan and South Sudan is another one. The Ukraine is another one. So many of the examples here came from other places in the world because they were the best examples.
Yeah, and it's, I think, such a service to the readers and to instructors to have this incredibly well curated set of examples. So let's dig into this topic. On the very first page of the book, you set readers with a challenge for thinking about life without easy energy access. And indeed, this book just pays such close attention to all of the social, economic, health-related dimensions of energy systems, and this orientation and what you've already said clearly aligns so closely with the ways in which geographers and this annual conference for the AGS are deeply concerned with geographical dimensions of inequality. So let's really just give you a chance to share with us the ways that the thread of energy is also a thread of inequality and injustice, and what are some of the key themes that and ways you approach that in this book?
Fundamentally, you have to think of energy as a basic human right. And when people don't have energy, nothing else works for them. It has to do with access and security, personal security. It has to do with their opportunities for advancement, has to do with comfort, has to do with disease. The fact that energy is not equally distributed around the world, except for solar, which we can talk about a little bit later. That fact alone means that some countries will, and they have, exploited other countries for their energy resources, and this is a common problem, and it leaves billions of people, literally billions of people, without access to sufficient energy. Everything flows from that. So it's a basic human right, but energy is not evenly distributed. So there's the big geographical basis for the book. And when you start to think about this, you realize how many events of the future, they're already starting, but how many more events are going to actually take place because we don't have equal distribution of energy resources.
So the access and inequality issues are quite robust and well covered in the book. And one of the chapters that really stuck out to me as a chapter that I think will really capture the imagination of your readers, all will, but I'm thinking about as a person that teaches a similar course, I think about what really turns my students on. And the chapter on risks and safety is, I think, a really interesting chapter because it reflects in our discipline a long-standing orientation with kind of that comes out of some of the key work in early energy resource geography being about nuclear siting and coming out of the period when nuclear risk was really a topic of everyday imagination. So I'm curious if you just tell us a little bit about that chapter and how that question of risks and safety intersects with ideas about inequality, which we've talked about primarily in terms of access, but how is risk and safety also an issue of energy justice or energy inequality?
I mean, this is an important question that you asked, Julia, and the idea here is multiple levels. But just if you get to that point where you're saying energy is a basic human right, and everybody needs energy, and people have lost track of where their energy comes from, it's become so easy turn on a switch, plug something in, and everything goes. You don't realize what happens before you get that energy. So nobody is thinking, or most people aren't thinking, gee, this electricity that I'm getting here has put people at risk to develop it, either in coal mines in Appalachia or even coal mines on the Navajo Nation, or the people who work on the transmission lines who have a hazardous job and are occasionally suffer electrocutions because of the work that's going on. We don't really realize how many elements there are tied to this that are matters of equality and equity. So it's the people that are supplying the energy that have safety and risk issues. We also have a responsibility for future generations. Now, I had a student the other day when I was talking to them about nuclear power, and I said, "Well, what about the nuclear power? What about the long-term waste disposal issue?" And they said, rather tongue-in-cheek, they said, "Well, what has the future generations ever done for us?" So I thought, okay, so it's true. I mean, what we're worried about today, we're worried about ourselves, we're worried about right now, and we have a hard enough time just kind of coping day to day. And so when you start to try to get people to think about the future, you realize how difficult that really is. And we've seen this just right now in Glasgow, where we're trying to get the hundreds of countries that are represented there, I think 200 countries represented in Glasgow at the climate summit, that there is a responsibility for the future generations. And it's, as the older I get, I could say, if I was completely cynical, I would say the older I get, the less I worry about this stuff. But I've got a daughter and I've got a grandson and I've got a lot. And as soon as you go outside, that narrow sphere, you realize there's just billions of people who are going to be suffering in the future if we don't take action on climate. So we have a responsibility, a spatial responsibility and a temporal responsibility that all comes back to this unequal distribution of energy and this unequal availability of energy resources. Some people have the energy, some people don't. The people who have it don't think much of about how it comes, where it comes from. People who don't have it spend almost all their time worrying about it.
I want to return to a thread, if you will, of something you said that really is resonant with me as an instructor, and that idea that we have this tremendous privilege, I think, as geographers that teach in this space, in the sense that, as you said, making a fundamental infrastructure of our lives visible is a moment in teaching which is often really like the light bulb goes on. There's so many corny analogies you could use here, but I love to hear you mention, this discussion with a student, and I wonder how students' appreciation, fundamental knowledge, the sets of priorities and concerns that they bring to thinking about energy, how that has evolved over the decades that you've been teaching this course, and to what extent this book reflects, those discoveries. And you can take this wherever you want, but I think it's really important for listeners to understand how much this book reflects this long career of interacting with those people whom we seek to impart with the knowledge to change the future. And I'm interested in how that has evolved over time for you.
Well, it has evolved, and I'm hopeful in that regard, because I see the students now more aware and more concerned about these types of issues. Now, granted, they self-select to take my class, so maybe they're already somewhat interested. But I had a student last semester who said, "Well, why is it that we're worried about climate change?" And the bubble above my head when I heard that question is, "What? You don't understand this?" And then I thought, all right, so he was brave enough to ask this question about 18-year-old young man, and we talked about that. But what I've seen over the years is that there is a greater awareness of things like climate change. There's a greater awareness of the impact of energy on people's lives, and the trade that has to go on. For example, Europe doesn't have enough natural gas, so Russia is supplying it. But just the other day, Russia started pulling some of that natural gas back into Russia, and I thought, man, that is a real problem. They're talking about having very cold winters in Europe this year, and they're very concerned about not having enough energy to stay comfortable. And one country has that kind of power over another group of countries. It's not just one; it's all of Europe that we're worrying about. So, and uh, another example, Australia started saying some things about China. China then got bent out of shape, and they said, "Well, we're not going to import any more coal from you." So they're running out of coal, and they are now opening up. They've closed a lot of mines, and now they're going to open up mines again. Well, China is one of the most dangerous places to be a coal miner. There's just thousands of deaths. So we have an international relationship that is bringing about health and safety risks, hazards to a group of people. When you start to think about the threat of energy, you start to realize how many places it goes and how significant it is. And if you can just get across that concept that is tied to everything, everything is tied to energy. That when you understand that, you start to appreciate um, some of these issues that are coming up that we're going to have to face. And we can talk about this, but one of those issues is mass migrations.
So I think this ties into an idea that was formulating for me as I was listening, which is I would be remiss if I didn't ask you in this interview to just comment on the way that energy is an entry into what geography has to offer, in the sense that we bring a particular mindset and habits of mind and ways of thinking that I think are really well suited to the kind of interscalar, interdependent nature of energy systems that you describe. But I'm also keenly aware as a geography professor that increasingly students identify themselves as environmental studies majors, or environmental scientists, or even climate change majors if they're so lucky to go to a school with the School of Climate. And sometimes we have to work to remind people that geography sort of is the original environmental studies program. So do you want to just reflect a little bit on what geographers have to offer broadly, kind of these problems in energy scholarship?
Sure. It's to me, and I've been doing this. I guess the first time I did a report on this in graduate school was 1972 or 73. So yeah, oh my gosh. So I was thinking of you at the time, I think, and I think yes, and I looked at, for example, kind of as a case study, the Imperial Valley of California, southeastern California, $2 billion a year in agricultural productivity there in the Imperial Valley, but they're underlain by tens of thousands of megawatts of geothermal energy. So the county came to the university hours at the time, UC Riverside, and they said, we have a problem here. How do we develop two resources in the same place at the same time without destroying one or the other? That was my dissertation, actually. Energy in an oasis. So that started things for me. And then I realized that because energy is not evenly distributed, and because it is sometimes site specific, like geothermal or wind, there's going to be land use conflicts in there. Well, that's right in the middle of what geographers tend to do. So it rather starts with this uneven distribution of energy and the need to trade. As soon as you start trading, it's where you packing it up, how are you shipping it, what are the routes, what is a piracy, which is going on a lot, we don't talk about too much, where are the port facilities, how it's being distributed by pipelines or by transmission lines. All that's geography, and a lot of it has to do with land use conflicts. It's right in the realm of geography in all kinds of ways. But it really starts with this kind of uneven distribution of energy. I think we might get around some of this as we increase our use of solar, and especially as we increase our use of storage capabilities, so we don't have to deal with that little nighttime problem with solar. But if you look at the situation in California, they have more solar generation during the day than they can use. We have actually in Arizona, which is a bordering state, as probably most people know, where they have paid us to take their electricity. They have an overabundance of solar during the day. Well, now they're starting to store that so they can use that at different parts of the time of the day. And the other part of that is if you look at they're just generation types during the day, and anyone can go on the website, KAISO, this website for California independent power producers and that sort of thing, as well as utility companies. You'll find that as solar starts to ebb off in the evening, wind picks up in many of these places. So the wind is always blowing someplace, and the sun is always shining someplace. So how are we going to actually blend that together? So I'm very hopeful that as we move toward renewables, we're going to start to remove some of these aspects of inequality.
Yeah, so let's we'll take, I'm going to introduce one other question before we get to a final question about kind of what the future looks like. But I want people considering this book to recognize a really wonderful gift that Dr. Pascaletti has brought to our community, which is a very intentional focus on collaborating with other disciplines, and in particular, collaborating with visual artists to communicate about energy systems. So do you want to briefly mention the wonderful chapter in this book on energy and art, and why art is so important, in your opinion, to conversations about energy systems?
I'm glad you brought that up, because during the review process of my prospectus for this book, many of the reviewers, and I don't know, there's 10 or 12 of them, many of them said they wanted to get rid of that chapter on art, and I resisted that, and so it's in the book. Because I think there's a lot of reasons for including art. One is because it attracts the students. It's visual, or you can, I show them movies, we play music. There's just thousands of folk songs about coal mining, for example. Monet is painted about art. Every artist seems to have some kind of link up with art. A friend of mine, Bernard Lang in Eastern Germany, for example, has some wonderful exhibits that he's done on, and these are art exhibits in art galleries in Paris and other places, of coal mines. I mean, these are just amazingly beautiful abstracts of aerial photographs of coal mines and other types of energy infrastructure. Other people have done this too. So I thought, if energy shows up in the arts, it's important. It's just it's a kind of a surrogate for how important energy is. When it shows up in the arts, it means it's significant. If people are worried about, if they're ever worried about energy, it's going to show up in the arts. And so I see that as an example of how important energy is in everyone's lives.
And
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll be curious with our colleagues as they roll this book out, that you might ask your students, which is, as you pick this book up off the shelf at the bookstore, I don't know if anybody does that anymore, but and you look at the table of contents, which chapter did you go to first? I just naturally went to the art one first, because I knew it would be an inviting entry point into these topics.
It is great fun. I have to tell you one story. There is a very famous song made famous. Merle Travis wrote it, but just hundreds of people have produced the same song, covered the same song. But Tennessee Ernie Ford did it. It's called 16 Tons. And it's 16 tons of number 9 coal, back that's weak, and a mind that's weak and a back that's strong. I mean, it is so, I play 7 or 8 versions of it. Johnny Cash, ZZ Top, Merle Travis, Tennessee Ernie Ford, just to illustrate to them how significant art can be in conveying the importance of energy, whether it's photography, sculpture, even plays. Sarcophagus is a play that I've seen twice now that tells the story of the people who worked at Chernobyl. Every medium has an element in it related to energy. There's a great book I have called Pitman Painters. These are coal miners in northern England who all got together and just painted coal mine scenes, hundreds of them, and published it. I have dozens of books on this. So it's and there's novels. Sherman Now by Zola is one of them. How Green Was My Valley is another one. There's all sorts of examples of this. So once it gets into the arts, you got to say, why is it showing up here? It's showing up because it's so important and fundamental.
And I just thank you for the correction that it's not only the visual arts, but arts in all forms.
Yes.
So as we wrap up, I want to emphasize that in the inviting nature of this text and its accessibility, overall, my take is that the text has a hopeful tone, which is not an easy thing to do when you are addressing all of the environmental as well as social inequalities and risks and problems that have been generated through, so to speak, through our relationship to energy procurement and distribution. But what is it, Mike, that gives you hope? And I want to ask you in these closing comments to really focus on thinking about the groups of people and the places that currently face the biggest risks with respect to perpetuating or worsening social inequality in energy systems. What needs to happen to mitigate those risks, to eliminate those risks of worsening inequalities? And is this a place that hope can extend into?
Well, part of the answer is where you and I work at universities. So we have the opportunity to help shape the minds and the thinking of our students. And it's a very concentrated opportunity. I think of it as kind of a funnel that the students go through for 4 years or sometimes longer. They come from all over the country, all over the world, and they're here with us on campus at ASU and other universities for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And while they're here, we can convey to them these messages to bring their awareness to a higher level. And I always end my classes with a hopeful note. And that note is the importance of moving away from carbon-based fuels and conventional fuels of all types and move more and more toward renewables. This has many advantages. It has climate advantages. It has equity advantages. So just imagine if you're south of the Sahara, where the majority of those without electricity are, and you find out that if you just put a solar power panel out there, you could charge a cell phone, or you could have a light at night, or you could even cook with it, or you can distill water with it. They don't have the hub and spokes kind of energy development that we have in this country. They don't have central power plants with distribution lines all over. They're going to avoid that. It's kind of like going from no telephone to a cell phone. They're going to leap right over. So one of the nice things, one of the essential things about renewables, especially solar, which is everywhere, is that they're going to have access. They're going to have access, and we need to do something to help them improve their access, because putting in conventional resource development in these countries is not the answer. It is simply not the answer. And there has been work, there's been work by many agencies, NGOs, by government agencies, to move in that direction. And I've been involved in a bit of that in Guyana and other countries, where we're bringing that opportunity for renewable energy. So not only does it affect the improve the quality of access to energy and improve the lifestyles of those people, but it also, in its wider distribution around the world, helps on the climate change. Now, we're not going to make that shift instantaneously. There's a lot of action moving in that direction, and now solar is cheaper than coal and nuclear or anything else. But it still takes time, because we got trillions of dollars of infrastructure out there that nobody wants to walk away from. And we're kind of used to these conveniences. We have to start changing. But that's where the university can come in and can help that transition. I think in 2 generations, we're going to be very more involved with the development of renewables. We're going to have a majority of our electricity coming from renewables. And on a given day in California, most of their electricity comes from renewables. So we are on the way. It will take time, and there will be resistance because things are changing, and nobody likes change except the people who don't have anything. So I think that I always look toward renewables as being one of the key and fundamental responses that we can make to move people toward a more equitable energy future.
Thank you for that. So I think we should, in deference to Zoom overload that people have, pause here. And so I'm going to offer a few thanks. I want to just recognize Dr. Pascaletti for his leading role in keeping energy system discussions vital in the field of geography during periods when it wasn't as sexy as it is now, frankly. And that expertise has translated into important work, not only in service to his discipline, but as he described, in service to communities and states and nations around the world. And we're incredibly grateful to your leadership in that space. For the students of the future, my own high school daughter who is really interested in this kind of thing, I think this book is a tremendous gift. And so we're thankful for that as well. And we'll thank the viewers for tuning in to this discussion and encourage you. I think you'll find Dr. Pascaletti to be a very accessible and engaging person. If you wish to follow up with him as you read the book, I certainly invite you to reach out to him at Arizona State University. And we'll thank the organizers at the American Geographical Society for featuring this important text in this year's conference. So we'll end there and thank everyone. And thank you most of all, Dr. Pascaletti.
Thank you, Julie. I've really appreciated it, and I've enjoyed this opportunity to express some of these, I think, optimistic perspectives.